Welcome to the recorded version of the Grantmakers in Aging web seminar, Social Impact Bonds, a model for aligning investment, risk, and outcomes, featuring Ian Galloway, Senior Investment Associate at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, Victoria Shire, Vice President of Vulnerable Populations, Enterprise Community Partners, Kippy Joseph, Associate Director for Innovation at the Rockefeller Foundation, and John Feather, CEO of Grantmakers in Aging, from May 15, 2013. This event was made possible by a partnership between Grantmakers in Aging and the John A. Hartford Foundation. Technical and production support is provided by the American Society on Aging.
So without further ado, let me turn it over to the CEO of Grantmakers in Aging, John Feather.
Thanks, Anita, and thanks all of you who have joined us today. We're delighted we have such a great group with us. A special thanks this month goes to Seth Snyder of the University of Texas for his help in providing the information that's on the GIA website on the issue of social impact bonds. Today's conversation with GIA turns to a topic that will be completely new to many of our participants. Social impact bonds and related pay-for-success arrangements are an exciting opportunity to reward the social service sector for evidence-based results and desired outcomes. Applying the model to programs and services for seniors should improve the social sector's effectiveness by rewarding programs that work, encouraging innovation, validating progress, and attracting private capital to the anti-poverty cause. In this event, we'll review pay-for-success social impact bond structures broadly, share ways to connect the model to seniors, and also provide clear pathways for how philanthropy of different sizes and scales can support innovation both locally and nationally. We are very pleased and honored to have three of our nation's best experts to help guide us through this discussion. Victoria Shire is Vice President for Vulnerable Populations at Enterprise Community Partners. She provides national leadership for all of Enterprise's activities in ending homelessness, providing quality housing and service solutions for low-income seniors across the country, and addressing the needs of extremely low-income members of our community. Ian Galloway is an investment associate at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. His primary responsibilities include at the Center for Community Development Investments. Kippy Joseph is Associate Director for Innovation at the Rockefeller Foundation, focused on an integrated approach of grant-making and internal capacity building. Domestically, her portfolio focuses primarily on the development and appropriate testing of the social impact bond concept. So welcome to you all. Victoria, let's start with you as we move to the next slide. What's our agenda for this presentation?
Sure. Thanks, John, and I'm really happy to be with everyone here today. We're really excited to have a conversation where we're going to review pay-for-success structures broadly, and when we say pay-for-success, what we mean is a programmatic structure where the agency that's paying for the service or outcome or intervention, whatever's happening in the program, but that those payments come only when the agreed upon targets or outcomes have been achieved. So we're going to talk about pay-for-success structures broadly, where social impact bonds are one way of setting up a pay-for-success structure. We're going to share some ways that we can connect that model to seniors and the outcomes that we care about with respect to low-income seniors. And we'll, as you mentioned, talk about some clear pathways for how philanthropy can support this kind of innovation both locally and nationally.
As we move to the next slide then, why are these new methods and tools important to us?
So this is, I think everyone who's been reading the news or following what's going on in our country, the things I'm about to highlight are not surprises. So we have diminishing public resources at all levels, at federal, state, and local levels, but we still have big social problems. We have, in this case, in this particular moment in time, some very significant diminished public resources that are available. We have historically siloed both resources and responses. So if there's an issue in healthcare, it's really only addressed by the healthcare sector. without a great way of connecting to the expertise and resources in other areas of our society. There is, however, this is still a country and an economy with a great deal of resource in it if we can figure out how to attract that capital that we haven't gotten to yet. So in this case, we're looking for an opportunity to bring private capital into problems that may have historically only been addressed through government funding. And in order to do that, we need to smooth the pathway to bring that private capital in and to leverage that against public investment. And then we want to be able to reward social interventions that actually work. We want to break the cycle of funding programs because that's the program that we fund. We want to be able to set up opportunities to reward innovation and reward things that actually deliver the successes and outcomes that we're looking for, both to encourage new innovation, but also to, as I mentioned before, attract new resources in private capital. And then we have an opportunity right now to refresh old tools or programmatic models for our changing demographics. And so we have, as many of you on this call know, we have an aging population in this country. We have a better understanding of what works, and we can apply that to update some of our historic models and modes of delivering services.
That's all very fascinating. Ian, let's turn to you next. You recently edited a copy of the Federal Reserve's journal on this topic. Tell us something about the kind of issues that we need to understand to better understand pay for success and social impact bonds.
Sure. Thanks, John, and thanks again for having me on today. I really appreciate it, and it's an honor, and I hope that the conversation at the end gets to the heart of how this will affect the folks who are listening in, because it really is cutting-edge community development and cutting-edge social policy, and I'm looking forward to that discussion. So this, on the slide here, you can see, just very quickly, the things I'd like to touch on in my presentation. First of all, what is pay for success? It's on everybody's minds these days, but it's still somewhat elusive in terms of what it really means and how it will affect all the folks involved in these transactions. I'd like to share some examples of pay for success. Some of them will be surprising. When we talk about pay for success and the social impact bond, it tends to be in the context of, well, this is a new thing, and we should be aware of it, and we need to learn how to use it effectively. That's not entirely true. This concept has been around for quite a while, just in different applications, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that. And then, of course, most of the folks on the call today are interested in learning more about the social impact bond, so I'm going to walk through very quickly the structure of the social impact bond so people can understand how it all fits together. What's in the Pay for Success pipeline in terms of funding and also in terms of the contracts that are currently being negotiated around the country. And then finally, if this is something that people are interested in pursuing, just some general tips on what to keep in mind and how to have these conversations with their local nonprofit partners, government partners, and foundation partners.
As we go to the next slide then, we're going to start turning now to the actual specifics of this. So what's the basic structure of a pay for success model?
Sure, and I apologize to everybody for this slide. My PowerPoint skills are somewhat wanting, but there will be an animation here that connects these two concepts. But at its root, the best way to think about pay for success is you have investments today that generate cost savings to government down the road. And the key to pay for success is connecting those savings, capturing those savings, and using them to fund the upfront investment. So if you can maybe click, I don't know if the animation is going to work. If it skips to there it is. I apologize again for this slide. It looked better on my computer than it does here, but I think people can understand the concept. Of course, this is just on a basic level how pay for success works. If we advance to the next slide, can get into a little bit more detail. This is really the key. There's two main ingredients to pay for success. The first is a performance-based contract. So a nonprofit, a service provider, let's say it's a service provider that promises to reduce recidivism at a local prison. That service provider contracts with the county government who pays for that prison, and they agree on some kind of performance-based contract where if the service provider is able to reduce the recidivism rate among a target population of folks who are in that prison or recently released from that prison, then the government will agree to pay the service provider a reward for having successfully hit their target. So as part of that, and I think you can all see the sub-points here, government needs to be on the hook for funding those successful outcomes. There needs to be some kind of independent impact auditor involved to certify that the outcomes have been achieved. That's a significant issue and not one that we should gloss over. And I certainly welcome conversation on that point at the end of the presentation. And then finally, government only pays for success. If the outcome is not achieved, then the reward is off the table. So the government has some protection against program failure, which is a critical component of pay for success. The second main ingredient of this concept is essentially the bridge financing. So how do you connect the upfront investments and the operating costs associated with funding the service provider with the downstream cost savings to government? And there's many ways to do this, and I'm sure Kippy will get into this in her presentation. Foundations certainly play a critical role in providing that upfront capital. But potentially, and this is what makes people, I think, particularly excited about pay for success, private finance can play a role here. Banks and other investors can essentially lend the money or invest the money up front with an expectation that they will get a portion, probably a significant portion, of the downstream savings from government. So that's sort of one of the big ideas behind pay for success. The private investor, the lender, the foundation, whoever it is, bears the risk that the intervention doesn't work, because, of course, if the intervention doesn't work, the reward is off the table. So you have the private sector, you have foundations, you have folks who know this stuff potentially better than government, underwriting the quality of the service provider and providing the financing to support that provider throughout the duration of the contract. So again, the sub-points here, you have a private investor. The financing terms typically are based on the difficulty of achieving success. If it's recidivism that has some risk associated with it, it could be something far more complex. For example, high school graduation and all of the things that go into that well in advance of interventions that occur later in the teenage years of high school students. Those interventions potentially begin in the womb or shortly thereafter. And the challenge of getting kids ready for school, prepared in school, and all the way through the pipeline and graduating from high school, for example, is a complex one and potentially increases the risk to the private investor that the intervention may fail. So that's one aspect of the financing terms. The track record of the service provider, if this is a provider that's been doing this for a long time, the risk goes down. If they haven't, then obviously the risk goes up. And then, of course, the length of the contract, the time horizon here. Is it a 15-year contract? Is it a 1-year contract? All of these things will affect the financing terms for the investor. And again, the investor bears the risk that success won't be achieved. Government only pays for success.
Before we move on, I wanted to remind our audience that you have the opportunity to ask questions, and the second half of our program will be a response to those. You need to type them into the box that you see to the right of your screen under questions. So you can go ahead and start doing that at any time, and I will start sorting through them so we'll be able to ask our panelists as we move forward. So as we move now, have moved now to the next slide, Ian. What are some examples of pay for success?
Sure, thanks, John. So here are a couple, and I mentioned before that some of them may be surprising to those of you who have not immersed yourself in the pay for success world yet. And I'm going to finish with the social impact bond because I'd like to go into a little bit more detail on the next slide. But first, prize-based philanthropy is probably the original use of pay for success. And I just, for those of you who are unfamiliar with this concept, I wanted to share a brief story about a recent case of this being very effective, and specifically the X Prize Foundation and their use of this tool to incentivize innovation in space technology. The X Prize Foundation agreed to pay $10 million to the first private company that could send 2 people into the stratosphere twice in 2 weeks. And it was up to those private companies to go out into the world and convince private investors that they had the right team of engineers and they had the right model for accomplishing the task, to raise that money to test the innovation and ultimately to secure the prize, get somebody into the stratosphere. So I believe something like 28 different companies competed to win this prize, and collectively those companies spent $100 million innovating to do so. One, I believe it was Spaceship One, which many of you may be familiar with, actually pulled it off. They did manage to get 2 people into the stratosphere, and they won the $10 million prize. But what's fascinating about this example in my mind is that here you have a case where instead of just granting $10 million to a spaceship company, which the X Prize Foundation could have done, they instead created a reward and left it to the private sector and to the folks who actually are doing the innovation on the ground to achieve and secure that award. And in doing so, creating sort of an incentive structure that encourages innovation and guarantees that the foundation, in this case, only pays for success. And so they, of course, got $100 million worth of innovation and a working spaceship to go along with it. So they were very successful in this case, and there's many other examples of this in different foundations in different industries. But I just want to share that as one example of pay for success, which may seem quite a bit different from what you thought it would be, but it is. They share many of the same characteristics as the social impact bond. Some of you may be familiar with the low-income housing tax credit. This is the primary way that the federal government builds multifamily affordable housing in this country. Since it was created in 1986, the credit has been responsible for the construction of almost 3 million units of affordable housing. The way the credit works is the federal government hands out credits to the states. The states then hand those credits to the developers. The developers then have to go out into the world and raise private funding to purchase the credits and then use the proceeds of that sale to build the housing. And the reason this is an example of pay for success is if the housing falls out of compliance, and compliance is tied to the affordability of the project, if that project becomes unaffordable for any reason over the course of a 15-year period, the investors who purchase the credits have them recaptured by the IRS at full loss. So the investors are very, very concerned about this issue and only invest in projects where they have a high degree of confidence that the developer is going to develop housing that's going to work for the local population and remain affordable for a 15-year period. So again, this is a pay-for-success type approach to a more conventional community development issue, affordable housing construction. Tax increment financing, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's also an example of pay for success. This is when developers sign contracts with local governments to freeze property taxes at their current rate, and then over the course of time, as that development transforms the neighborhood and property taxes increase, that increment is then rerouted back to the investors who funded the development that led to the transformation of the neighborhood. So that's, again, an example of pay for success. The Human Capital Performance Bond is a slightly different approach to this concept. It's similar to the Social Impact Bond, but slightly different. It's been approved by the Minnesota legislature, and just very quickly, the goal is to tie payouts to individual taxpayers who, when they no longer use public services, the state of Minnesota can identify those cost savings and use some portion of those cost savings to reward the service provider, the nonprofit, who supported that person and got them out of poverty and into a position where they're no longer receiving public welfare. So it's a slightly different approach, but it has slightly different characteristics than maybe some of you are familiar with as it pertains to the social impact bond. So finally, the social impact bond, I want to spend a little bit of time on this.
Well, and as we move to the next slide, this is all a very intriguing concept, and as you say, much more varied than I think we were thinking it might be. But it's also a somewhat complex and confusing idea. So could you walk us through this diagram and tell us how the basic structure of this works?
Sure, I can. And it is confusing. And at the very end, I just want to remind people that not to get hung up on these individual tools, because the bigger concept is much simpler, and that is, of course, you're connecting investment up front to downstream cost savings, and you're just building financing mechanisms that capture those savings and use those savings to pay for the upfront investment. So that's at its core, that's what we're talking about, and not to get too hung up on the specifics. So here's the social impact bond. This is a diagram that was created by McKinsey and Company. Just really quickly, and you of course can all read this, but traditionally, starting at the bullet point 1 here, the government tends to pay for costly remedial programs. So after people have experienced some challenge, whether they're in prison or whether they're impoverished and require food stamps or whatever it is, government tends to pay for the programs that address those needs. So the concept behind the social impact bond and other pay-for-success models is, well, what if we invested in things that kept them from requiring those remedial services? So instead of just paying directly to deal with those problems, the government instead contracts with an intermediary. That intermediary signs a contract with nonprofit service providers who can support the needs of the target population, and investors fund the contract, and the money, the revenue raised from that contract is used to pay the service providers who are on the ground actually supporting the target population. There's some period of time that goes by at which point an independent impact auditor comes in, evaluates whether or not the constellation of services that were provided by the nonprofit partners of the intermediary actually worked. If they did work, then the investors who paid for those services are receive their principal investment in addition to a bonus return, which can differ depending upon the individual contract. And in this way, government keeps people from requiring services that are very expensive, but only pays for interventions that actually work. So that's the social impact bond as a structure, and I want to make it really clear for those of you who are unfamiliar with the social impact bond. It's not actually a bond. That's incredibly misleading and I think confusing for a lot of folks. This is there's a little bit of lost in translation here. This is a concept that was developed in the UK, and bond in the UK actually means something slightly different than it does here. So I'd encourage everybody, to the extent possible, to forget that this is called a social impact bond and think of it more as a bridge loan or an investment.
Okay. So we can blame the British for this.
Yeah.
Okay. As we move on to the next slide, then, you talked that there were some projects that are already on the move with this that might provide examples for us. Could you walk us through some of those?
Sure. So this, John, as you mentioned at the beginning of your introduction, this is something that a lot of people seem to be interested in these days, and there is actually a lot of momentum all over the country. I'm aware of negotiations that are taking place in California, Utah, Minnesota, Ohio, New York, and Massachusetts. And then, of course, there are social impact bond deals already done in the UK, Canada, and Australia. So this is something that's definitely coming online. As you can see from the slide here, there are over 30 state, county, and municipal governments who are looking at this and considering developing Pay for Success projects. There are a wide range of applications for Pay for Success. Here are, as you can see, there are a few: healthcare, recidivism, workforce development, elderly assisted living, supportive housing, early childhood, and environmental projects are all ripe, I think, for this type of intervention. And finally, the administration recently released its budget, and in that budget was a $300 million line item for Pay for Success that would be housed in Treasury, and it would be used to both credit enhance contracts, deals, but also to pay for technical support to help foundations, service providers, and governments get a handle on this and jumpstart this in their locality.
As we move to the next slide then, so if people are interested in this, what are your suggestions in terms of pursuing the Pay for Success models?
Sure. So first of all, I think it's really important that you clarify your value proposition. You need to be very deliberate about how you explain as a service provider what are you doing and how is it saving money to government. And if that's not clear, then I think you're going to have a hard time getting the attention of your local government or your local payer, because if they can't attribute success to you, then they'll attribute it to somebody else. So you need to be very clear about what are you bringing to the table and how will they know when you've succeeded. Second of all, and this is a really key point and one that has not been, I think, fully fleshed out from an industry standpoint, cost savings will accrue to a number of different parties. For example, if you are building a supportive housing project for the chronically homeless or the chronically homeless who happen also to be seniors, and you're moving those folks off of the streets and into some kind of permanent housing solution, the savings that will be generated from that intervention will accrue to the county hospital. It will accrue to the city. It will accrue potentially to a number of local partners on the ground who would otherwise be paying for the services that address the needs of that population of people. So when we construct these contracts, we need to have a clear payer on the other end who says, I'm going to take on the payment for success here based on the savings that accrue to me or some coalition of folks, and be very clear about where is that money going and who are we going to capture it from. And I think this is, as I mentioned, sort of an issue that has not been fully fleshed out, and I think it's a potentially huge roadblock to the adoption of Pay for Success strategies. Third, because you have savings accruing to a number of different partners, I would encourage you to look at as broad a range of potential service providers and potential payers as possible. For example, in community development, a lot of our work generates cost savings to Medicaid and Medicare. So we're doing more and more work with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation to try to develop some kind of partnership that captures some of those cost savings and uses them to pay for community development work. And I think a lot of people would not normally consider community development and health to be that closely related, but they are, and it's important that those partnerships be codified in some way and could ultimately be the basis for a Pay for Success contract with a health organization being the payer for a community development intervention. And I think that applies to a number of other fields as well. And as I mentioned before, don't get hung up on the financing vehicle. The social impact bond is sort of the more interesting topic of conversation these days, but it is one of many. And if that isn't the right structure, there are others. So don't worry if the social impact bond is not a perfect fit for you. These contracts can be customized in any number of ways as long as they have those two key ingredients, the performance-based contract and some kind of bridge financing included. And ultimately, remember, this is just about managing cash flows. This is investment at the front end, generating cost savings at the back end, and capturing those cost savings and using them to fund the upfront investment. So it's really at its core a relatively simple idea, but it has the potential to be enormously disruptive for the social sector as a whole, and I look forward to getting into that in more detail in the Q&A.
Speaking of which, I want to remind all of our audience that they can send in their questions by typing into the question field that you find on the right side of your screen. So please go ahead and do that at any time. We'll be moving to the questions a little bit later in the presentation. So Victoria, let's bring you back in at this point. Our audience here on this program are all interested in programs that make life better for older people. How do you see social impact bonds helping in that regard?
I think that's a great question. And on the slides here, I put a couple of things. One thing that's sort of in this audience's interest in helping making life better for older people means you could, anything almost is a potential opportunity here. But as Ian described, you need to be able to articulate what the actual service intervention is and what are the savings look like. And so a couple of an example here that comes to mind most often in these discussions is around interventions that result in avoidance of costly healthcare events. So things like reduced falls, reduced hospitalizations, reduced ER visits. And so what would that intervention look like? It could be something like wellness and strength training and nutrition classes that improve the physical strength of an individual so that they are less likely to fall. There's a lot of research on falls prevention. Taking that research and that evidence base on what the right programmatic components are is really important. And I want to just emphasize that where pay-for-success models work best is where there's an evidence-based programmatic intervention. So you need to be able to say, we're doing this rather than that because we know that this works and this is ready to be scaled or implemented in a way that replicates the evidence, the success that's already been placed. So this is not a good place for innovation based on totally brand new programmatic models. You really want to have something that works. So you go into the research and you look for the programmatic interventions that are shown to work, and then you look for opportunities to scale or replicate. And so you could be looking for savings in the healthcare sector. You could be looking for programs that avoid nursing home admissions and that enable people to remain living independently at home. Enterprise and my co-presenters here, we're all coming out of the community development field, so we're often thinking about how do we improve the connection between services and housing? How do we use housing as a platform for success? And so whether you have someone who's living in a single-family home, independently living, how do you keep them independently living? What are the programmatic interventions that you can bring there? There are, a lot of examples in the healthcare sector. There are, because that's sort of a very present and front of mind part of our context right now is in lowering public healthcare costs and doing something to harness that trajectory. But there are interventions that you could conceive of that are related to transportation and better connecting people in rural areas or who are outside of dense environments, urban environments, to better connect to resources that are available, whether that's through improved transportation or virtual senior centers that by reducing social isolation, you decrease depression or other negative outcomes that come from social isolation. So those are a couple of just broad examples of where you could bring a pay-for-success model. And I think addressing the seniors population, there's a great opportunity here because that is a population, particularly with respect to healthcare costs, where we know that there's a trend that we can do something about.
Well, actually, on the next slide, I think we have an example of walking through more specifically on a healthcare example. So why don't you help us with that one?
Yeah, so this is just to sort of give a programmatic example to the broad framework that Ian outlined. So if you take falls, for example, and that a slip and fall can lead to nursing home care, which is priced at, say, $54,000 a year. If you have a programmatic intervention that costs $1,500 a year, that intervention consists of capital improvements in the home, installing grab bars, changing doorways, adding guide rails, some necessary capital improvements there, and then some kind of regular service where you're bringing services to that resident in their home. That if that package costs $1,500 a year and reduces nursing home admissions by 15%, this is how you would think about how to plug that program into a pay-for-success model. So you'd say, well, let's say we have a population of 10,000 frail elderly that generally, in the normal course of time, has a 20% admission rate to nursing homes. So you would say, well, if we take 10,000 people times that 20%, we have 2,000 people going to nursing homes each year. If we can reduce that 2,000 people going to nursing homes each year by 15%, so we have a program that can reduce nursing home admissions by 15%, we would prevent 300 people from going to nursing homes. That 300 people at $54,000 a year is a $16.2 million avoided cost. Well, it only would cost us $15 million to deliver that service to 10,000 people. So we'd have a net savings of $1.2 million, and that's your shared savings that gets negotiated in a pay-for-success contract that's used to pay back the investor with some upside or however the transaction is structured. But this was just meant to give you sort of an idea of how we get from I have a program that works to what a pay-for-success program looks like.
Well, I think as we move to the next slide, one of the challenges for all of us to really get our heads around this issue is that we need to have some more specific models that are actually being implemented. And here's one that's starting to be developed in New York City. Could you tell us a little bit about that one?
Absolutely. So Self-Help is a service provider and a housing provider in New York City. They have a great track record in both providing senior housing as well as services as a community-based organization. And what they are doing, and the enterprise is working with them through our Learning Collaborative for Senior Housing and Services, which is the national program. Self-Help is one of 12 teams in the program. And what they're doing is they're looking at their collection of services and the connection to housing, and as well as their connection to primary care physicians. They have a health home program. Their housing is located near healthcare facilities and senior centers. They incorporate a variety of technology-based preventative care, ranging from virtual senior centers, which is the picture on the top of the slide there, where homebound seniors have an opportunity to connect with other folks who can get to the senior center. And on a regular basis, they're both engaging in conversation, both structured and unstructured. There's also an opportunity to do distance learning. They have a partnership with the Metropolitan Museum of Art to do art history classes using video cameras and online technology. But they're also using that technology in their housing. So they have sensor-based technology, which enables family members and nurses to monitor at a lower cost, very little disruption in an individual's life, to check in on things like their blood pressure and their weight and how did they sleep last night and are they eating and what did they eat yesterday, and all those kind of early warning indicators that can help you catch something before it becomes a more expensive or more disruptive event in someone's life. So they're taking a look at all of those programs that they're running and working to organize and package that in such a way that we could say, if we deliver this set of services, we can expect these kinds of outcomes. And right now, this is an organization that is funded through a lot of philanthropic funding, direct grants, and through government contracts. And we're looking for opportunities to leverage that evidence into an opportunity to scale up what they're doing. So they started work with Enterprise a couple of years ago in sort of a conversational way, and we're working much more intensively over the next 2 years to really articulate what is that package of housing and services that can reliably deliver outcomes generally related to reductions in hospital visits or better outcomes in those transition moments when someone does have a health event and needs to leave the home and then come back in, or related to self-management of health issues like diabetes or things that stem from nutrition or medication compliance.
Well, absolutely fascinating to hear that example, which many of us would identify with. Let's bring Kippy in at this point as we move to the next slide. You and your colleagues at the Rockefeller Foundation are working very intensively on social impact bonds. What advice do you have for funders, both big and small, who might be interested in this as a way of moving this work forward in their own communities?
Thank you. I think first I just want to say to, I guess, my peers on the line that while many of us who work in philanthropy focus on making a difference in individuals' lives and stepping in where there are systems failures, we also have, in some ways, the luxury to serve at a larger scale as society's risk capital. So we can take the risks that government cannot take with taxpayer money, or that private corporations are not motivated to do for a lack of profit, or that, in some way families or communities can't do in their own right. So it feels to me in some ways that the social impact bond provides a real opportunity for the philanthropic community to demonstrate their role in providing some of that risk capital. And I'll just share a little bit about how the Rockefeller Foundation got involved with the social impact bond, first as a concept, which is that we have a funding program here focused on impact investing. And in 2009, we gave a grant to an organization in the UK called Social Finance to experiment and research a new set of finance mechanisms that would allow private money to achieve social good while aiming for a double bottom line, if that's familiar to you all, for doing good while doing well. So having some social benefit and also having some financial return. And the social impact bond was the first concept that they developed, and it was quickly picked up in the UK by the Ministry of Justice and developed into a pilot in partnership with some community-based organizations working in the area of recidivism prevention. And so the first pilot program is called the Peterborough Pilot because the very first social impact bond was issued to work with, to provide funding for specific interventions for short-term male prisoners being released from the Peterborough prison. And so subsequently, the foundation became the only institutional investor from the U.S. to invest in the social impact bond, along with a set of investors who are philanthropically motivated, mainly in the UK. So we had our experience there and really learned that in many ways the devil is in the details, and that's not unfamiliar to anyone who's working on a complex problem. But the task of unlocking new financial flows for social services is a pretty challenging one, but also holds a tremendous amount of promise. The idea of the social impact bond caught on here in the U.S., and I will say in the early days, which, talking about 2009, 2010 here, it was more hype than it was substance. And so we felt a real responsibility to share our perspective and our learning from our experience in the UK, and to also think through, again, from this position of taking on risk for society, what an appropriate ecosystem of players would look like in order to appropriately test this innovative financing vehicle in a U.S. context. And so that's where we started really thinking through the levels at which change needed to happen to enable this social impact bond to be tested, and that includes levels of government, both local, state, and federal. It includes the way social service providers, most of which are nonprofit, track their data and measure their outcomes and make the case for not only the effectiveness of their programs, but how that impact can be monetized for government or taxpayer savings. And then it also included understanding who the potential investors are that act as new funders of this kind of activity. So we're not interested in the social impact bond creating an opportunity for foundations to play a shell game. You used to give a grant to an organization, and now you give a PRI to a intermediary who then funds an organization to provide the same services. That's not what we're interested in. But where are the new sources of funding, these impact investors who want to do good but also understand that there is some excess or some margin to be had in funding prevention rather than funding cure. So we did that, and we funded, bits and pieces here and there of all those places that I mentioned, and we feel like the U.S. is in a pretty good place. As John and Ian were mentioning earlier, there's a lot of momentum around the testing of social impact bonds across many different issue areas, across many regions of the country, across different levels of government and activity, so local, county, and state to date. And so we feel like there's a lot happening that will enable us to properly test this social impact bond concept to see, is this something that we can really rely on in the future to provide adequate funding for our most effective interventions to reach the number of people or reach the scale at which they're having maximum benefit, while simultaneously saving taxpayer money and potentially bringing in new flows of funding from private investors. But I will stress that there are many ways for philanthropy to be involved in this idea. Very often we hear about the idea of sequencing funding for an intervention, and I like to think of the social impact bond as presenting opportunities for a very, very stretched out sequence of funding. So, for example, I think many of the funders on the line probably fund capacity building at the nonprofits that work in your area. That's an essential part of ensuring that there are interventions that could attract the kind of funding that we're talking about. If a nonprofit doesn't have appropriate measures of their success, if they can't demonstrate efficacy in a way that is verifiable, then they will never be in a position to look for additional or outside funding from their regular sources. So capacity building is one way that we can get on the road towards social impact bonds and ensure that there will be a robust pipeline of deals in the future. Equally, because this kind of public-private partnership is different than most that we see in the social services sector, the government actors who need to be in partnership in order to create these contracts, these pay-for-performance contracts, really need to be engaged and educated about this concept. And often funders are in a position of relative objectivity such that government will trust them not to sell them a bill of goods, for example. You may be in close touch with the Commissioner of Aging in your local area who will listen to ideas that you have differently than they will listen to it from the service provider themselves. So providing the nudge for government to get engaged, and then in some cases provide the funding for government to really have the capacity or the bandwidth to pay attention to this is a critical thing. And then when we move towards specific deals, many of these deals are being put together by nonprofits and intermediaries who are doing so with no specific funding to support them. And that's a real risk. Our sector is pretty poor at funding the research and development side of things, and so that's a really clear opportunity for funders to get involved. The main idea that funders, especially those who are engaged in making PRIs or MRIs, have latched onto is the idea that foundations can invest in social impact bonds, and at the Rockefeller Foundation, we are encouraging foundations to think about ways that their investment can be concessionary or subordinate to attract more commercially oriented money. And the idea here is we are really going after money that currently does not flow in this direction, not that we're necessarily interested in subsidizing profit for commercially oriented investors. But if we can attract that money, we have a better chance of scaling the services since the need is greater than the funding that government and philanthropy together can offer. The last piece here is that a lot of this is happening without appropriate evaluation and learning mechanisms. The Nonprofit Finance Fund runs something called payforsuccess.org, which is a learning hub, but to date it is the only learning hub that ensures some kind of transparency in this market, and I will tell you from being its primary funder that it is underfunded for what it needs to do. And equally, the evaluations that are happening on a deal-by-deal basis to create the metrics by which a repayment is made, not to evaluate the social impact bond concept and its effect overall on government, on the beneficiaries, on the nonprofit. That kind of wraparound evaluation model is another area of need. So I'm going to stop there in the interest of time. I can provide examples of what we have done, but I think it's better to, John, if you agree, get to the questions.
Well, I think we have a few, and I would like to make sure that we get them answered by you. But I think what we're going to have to do is bring it to the wrap-up phase, and we will pose the questions that you've given to me to our panelists, and then post them on our website, giaging.org. So as we come to the end of the hour, then I do want to ask each of you to share any final thoughts you have. This is a particularly complex issue, and so it takes a while longer than in some other cases to lay it out. But Victoria, let's start with you. What are the final things you want people to remember about this process?
Sure. I think seeing this as an opportunity to engage in a new kind of conversation with organizations that may have traditionally been your grantees. This is an opportunity to say, if you weren't operating within the confines of your latest government contract or even your latest grant from our organization, what would you do? What do you know works? What evidence-based practice would you like to bring into your constellation of services and interventions, and how can we help you do that? I think also having philanthropy play a leading role in saying that they want to see government and service providers at the table in these new ways is really important. And as Kippy said, the service providers and the intermediaries who are trying to figure out how to make this work, we're doing it, on our own budgets. And it's really important to know that we have the support of the philanthropic sector in doing that research and development, because it's going to take a couple of, not perfectly successful efforts to get this right.
Ian, how about you?
I think I would just maybe a word of caution that we should not recklessly pursue pay for success. I'm personally very optimistic that it's going to be a useful tool in the social sector, but there are important ethical considerations that I think are worth considering. And just to give you one example, and this is actually outlined in an article in that journal that you referenced earlier, John. If you look at nonprofit and for-profit nursing homes, for-profit nursing homes, according to this study, were 4 times as likely to use sedatives as nonprofit nursing homes. And the theory was that it was more efficient from a profit maximizing standpoint to do that than to engage the population of the in the nursing home from an interpersonal standpoint. And I think that's really important, because if we create contracts that reward success, and in this case we say success is happy members of a nursing home community, without looking deeper and considering how did you get there, and were appropriate steps taken to ensure that population is well cared for and not taken advantage of. I think this has huge potential risk. In particular, if we're talking about vulnerable populations like the aging population. So just a word of caution that as we adopt these new tools, this is not the privatization of the social sector. This is, as Kippy mentioned, a public-private partnership, and there needs to be controls in place that ensure the safety of the population that's being served, and not just depend upon the private sector to do the right thing.
An important point. Kippy?
I think the takeaway for me here is that preventative services are the first to go in budget crunch times, and we are in those times for the foreseeable future. So we really need to be creative with how we expand the pie of funding for those preventative kinds of services. And with respect to the beneficiaries that your group focuses on, the social impact bond provides an opportunity to open up a conversation with all the stakeholders about how to expand that pie for the desperately needed preventative services.
Well, I want to thank Victoria Shire, who is Vice President for Vulnerable Populations at Enterprise Community Partners, Ian Galloway, Senior Investment Associate at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, and Kippy Joseph, the Associate Director for Innovation at the Rockefeller Foundation, for your participation in today's program. Thank you all for everything you do to make life better for America's older adults. I also want to thank the John A. Hartford Foundation for their support of this program, as well as the American Society on Aging for their technical expertise. Remember that we have a great summary resource for funders on social impact bonds on the GIA website. And join us in June for a webinar on social entrepreneurship among those above the age of 60. In July, we'll be focusing on the link between health, aging, and the arts. And in August, we'll be doing an update on the debate around Social Security reform. And finally, I want to thank all of you for your participation in today's webinar. Have a great day.